Zane Corrigan gripped the controls of his stolen starship, the Vengeance, as it skimmed the outer edge of the planet Tralis IV, a desolate world on the fringes of the galaxy. His dark eyes scanned the radar, searching for any signs of pursuit. The bounty hunters had been relentless, and the last ambush had cost him 3 of his best men. He couldn't afford another slip-up. He needed to disappear again, find a new place to lay low, maybe settle on a backwater world where no one knew his name. The galaxy had forgotten about him, or so he hoped. But fate had other plans. "Captain, we've got company," said Terran, his second in command, a young but deadly sharpshooter who'd become fiercely loyal after Zane had saved her life during a raid on the Sarunan trade route. Her voice crackled over the comms, cold with urgency. "4 ships, they're coming in fast." Zane's heart rate quickened. No time to run. He slapped a button on the console, pulling up the ship's defensive systems. His fingers danced over the controls as he maneuvered the ship in a steep dive, dodging the incoming fire. The Vengeance shook as enemy blaster bolts slammed into the hull, sending shudders through the entire ship. "Shields at 50%, Terran reported, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We're going to need a miracle to get out of this one." "Just keep them off us for a minute," Zane grunted, gritting his teeth as he pushed the ship to maximum thrust. His mind raced, calculating trajectories, enemy movements, and escape routes. There were no safe havens nearby, just a sea of asteroids, an endless stretch of deadly rock fields, and nothing to hide behind. The enemy ships came into view. Sleek, black vessels with glowing red insignias. The bounty hunters had found him again, and this time, they weren't going to let him slip away. Without warning, the comm system buzzed to life. The voice that came through was cold, familiar. "Zane Corrigan, you've got one chance to surrender. Otherwise, we'll have to hunt you down like the dog you are." Zane's lips curled into a grim smile. Moran, the bounty hunter who had nearly caught him on Virex. He was the one who kept showing up in every sector, every system. If there was one thing Zane hated more than being hunted, it was being hunted by a man who knew his every move. "Tell Moran I'm not in the mood for a reunion," Zane muttered. He turned the ship sharply, sending the Vengeance spiraling through the asteroid field, weaving through the massive rocks at breakneck speed. The enemy ships followed, unwilling to give up the chase. Behind them, a distant flash of blue light appeared, a distress beacon. Zane's gut twisted. There was no time to investigate, but the signal had caught his attention. Something about it felt urgent. A sudden explosion rocked the Vengeance, pulling Zane's focus back to the immediate threat. The enemy was closing in, their blasters finding their mark more often now. "We're not going to last much longer like this, Captain," Terran warned, her voice sharp with tension. Zane's mind raced as the chase turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. He needed a distraction, something to turn the tide. His eyes flicked back to the beacon, a chance to survive or a trap. "Prepare to make a hard turn," he ordered. "We're going to change the game." Terran didn't ask questions. She trusted him. In one fluid motion, Zane spun the ship, pulling the Vengeance into a sharp arc that sent it plunging toward the surface of the planet. Below them, the cityscape of Tralis IV appeared, burned-out husks of buildings, the scars of a forgotten war. Zane's fingers gripped the throttle with a newfound resolve. As the ship plummeted through the atmosphere, an explosion erupted in the distance, too close for comfort. The bounty hunters were right behind them, and the final moments of Zane's freedom were ticking down. The signal was still there. "Set course for the beacon. Let's see what they're hiding." Terran shot him a puzzled look but nodded, executing the evasive maneuver without hesitation. As the Vengeance dove toward the planet's surface, Zane knew there was no turning back now. Whatever waited at that beacon was about to change the course of his life and the galaxy's fate. And for the first time in years, Zane didn't feel like the hunted. He felt like the hunter. But only for a moment. The Vengeance crashed through the dense atmosphere of Trallis IV, its engines screaming in protest as it tore through the thick clouds. Zane barely managed to pull the ship into a steep ascent, skimming the jagged mountain peaks below. The bounty hunters were persistent, relentless in their pursuit, but Zane knew the wild terrain would work to his advantage. As he weaved the ship through narrow canyon passes and over ancient ruins, the enemy ships struggled to keep up. The sound of their weapons cracking through the sky reverberated in his ears, but he stayed focused. "Incoming!" Terran shouted, her voice tight with concentration. "2 more on our tail." Zane gritted his teeth. He had no intention of leading these hunters to wherever the beacon was coming from. That signal might be his only chance to escape, to find something, anything, that could help him get off this damn planet before his past caught up with him. Without warning, he hit the throttle, sending the ship into a steep dive toward a dense forest below. The ship screamed as it barreled toward the ground, the forest canopy just inches from their hull. He barely made it, the ship's belly scraping against the tops of the trees, as he thrust the Vengeance into a sudden roll to avoid a missile from the pursuing ships. The ship's hull groaned in protest, but Zane didn't flinch. He trusted his ship. He trusted his crew. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a spark of hope, something other than the weight of survival. The sound of the pursuing ships was beginning to fade. Zane glanced at Terran, her fingers flying over the controls as she rechecked their flight path. "All systems green, Captain," she said, though the tension in her voice was palpable. "We've shaken them for now, but we can't stay here long." Zane nodded, though his mind was already elsewhere. His hand hovered over the comms panel. He needed to see who or what was behind the beacon. The ship's autopilot engaged, and the coordinates they had plotted led them to the remote outskirts of a long-abandoned research station, hidden deep within the planet's thick jungles. The station had once been a hub for a failed scientific project, but the records were vague at best. Zane had heard rumors, old stories of classified experiments, but nothing concrete. As they approached the derelict station, Zane felt a chill run down his spine. There was something off about this place. The beacon signal was strong now, almost too strong. Something, or someone, was waiting for them. "Hold tight," Zane muttered, flipping switches on the console as the ship descended toward a makeshift landing pad littered with debris. As the Vengeance touched down, a sudden sense of unease washed over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that walking into this place might be a step into something much darker than he was ready to confront. "Stay sharp," he said to Terran, who nodded with the same grim resolve. They stepped out into the overgrown ruins, the air thick with humidity and the scent of decaying vegetation. The station loomed ahead, a skeleton of steel and glass that had long since lost any sign of life. But the beacon signal was coming from within. As Zane and Terran moved deeper into the ruins, every step echoed in the hollow silence. The faint hum of the beacon grew louder, guiding them toward an underground access point. Zane's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but there was no going back now. This place was calling to him, whether he liked it or not. Reaching the entrance, Zane hesitated for a moment, scanning the area. Something about the station felt personal, like it was meant for him to find. Terran didn't wait. She activated the door, and with a hiss of air, it slid open. Inside was a dark corridor, illuminated only by the flickering lights of the emergency system. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the metal halls as they moved deeper into the facility. Suddenly, a voice crackled over their comms, one Zane hadn't heard in years. "Zane Corrigan," it said, cool and familiar. "It's been a long time." Zane froze, his heart sank. The voice belonged to Arilith, the alien diplomat he had met only hours before. But the message was different now. This wasn't a plea for help. This was a warning. "I know what you've found," she continued, her voice laced with a mixture of fear and authority. "And I know what you've become." It's time to face the truth about why you're here. Zane's blood ran cold. He had come to this station searching for an escape. Instead, he had walked straight into the heart of a conspiracy that could shatter everything he thought he knew about his past. And there was no turning back now. Zane's hand hovered over his blaster as he and Taryn entered the darkened hallway of the abandoned research station. The hum of the emergency lights was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. He had expected this to be a simple retrieval mission, an opportunity to escape the bounty hunters on his tail. Instead, he had stumbled into something much larger, something that would force him to confront his past. "Do you hear that?" Taryn whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows ahead. Her weapon was already drawn, a sleek, modified pulse rifle designed for precision. Zane nodded, his senses sharpening. The voice on the comms had unsettled him, but it wasn't just Arilith's words that bothered him. The deeper they went into the station, the more the air seemed to thrum with a strange energy, as if something, or someone, was watching them. They rounded a corner, the emergency lights flickering in a stuttering pulse. The source of the hum became clearer. A large, reinforced door stood ahead, its surface embedded with strange symbols. It looked like the entrance to a vault, and Zane had a sinking feeling that whatever was inside was the key to everything. The beacon signal pulsed from behind that door, calling him toward it, like a silent summons. Taryn moved forward cautiously, placing her hand on the door's cold metal surface. "This is it," she muttered. "Whatever we're after, it's in there." Zane stood back, watching for any signs of movement. His mind was a swirl of conflicting thoughts. Part of him wanted to turn back, to leave the past buried where it belonged. But the other part of him, the part that had always fought, knew that turning back wasn't an option. The galaxy was at stake, and he was too far in now to escape it. "On my mark," he said, glancing at Taryn. Taryn gave a brief nod, her face a mask of concentration. Zane hit the button to activate the door, and it slid open with a hiss, revealing a dimly lit chamber. The space was vast, filled with rows of empty cryo chambers, their glass panes cracked and covered in dust. But at the far end of the room, there was something else, something that made Zane's pulse quicken. A figure stood there, bathed in the faint glow of a terminal. The person was tall, cloaked in a long black coat, their face hidden in shadows. But Zane didn't need to see their face to know who they were. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, their voice cold, yet oddly familiar. Zane's grip tightened on his weapon as he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Arilith," he said, his voice low with a mix of disbelief and anger. "What the hell is this? What game are you playing?" The figure slowly raised their hands, a signal of surrender. "I'm not your enemy, Zane. Not anymore." Taryn glanced at Zane, then back at the figure, clearly confused. "Who is this?" Zane's eyes never left Arilith as she stepped into the light, her expression unreadable. "What are you talking about? Why bring me here? I thought you were trying to stop the SLTHAR." "I am," Arilith said, her voice trembling slightly. "But there's more going on than you know. I didn't just bring you here to escape your past. I brought you here because you're the only one who can stop it." The words hung heavy in the air as Zane processed them. His mind spun with possibilities, but none of them seemed to fit. He had been running from his past for years, hiding from the mistakes he made, the people he betrayed. Now, Arilith was telling him that everything, the bounty hunters, the XLTHAR, even the beacon, was leading him back to something much larger, something he had to face. "I don't know what you're talking about," Zane said, his voice edged with frustration. "I'm no hero. I'm not the one you need." "You don't understand, Zane," Arilith replied, her voice softening. "The XLTHAR are not just an invading force. They were created by your rebellion. They're the result of something you and your comrades set in motion years ago. They were meant to be the ultimate weapon, the final solution. But something went wrong. Something broke inside the project." Zane's heart sank as the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. "You're saying they were us? The soldiers, the rebels, they were turned into this. He couldn't believe it. The Exelthar, the ruthless, bloodthirsty empire created by their own hands. Arilith nodded, her eyes shadowed with regret. You and your team were the last test subjects. The experiment that was supposed to end the war, but something went wrong. The Exelthar were never meant to control. They were meant to be weapons, nothing more, and now they're coming for you. Terran's voice cut through the air, sharp with disbelief. You're saying Zane's the key to stopping them. Arilith's eyes locked onto Zane's. Yes, you were there at the beginning. You were part of the experiment. You are the one who can stop them. Zane's breath hitched. He wanted to deny it, to reject everything Arilith was saying. But deep down, he knew she was right. He couldn't escape his past, no matter how far he ran. I didn't ask for this, Zane muttered, his voice barely a whisper. But I guess that doesn't matter anymore. Exactly, Arilith said, her tone firm. Now, we need you to lead. Gather the forces, unite the factions. Together, we can stop the Exelthar before they destroy everything. Zane stood silent for a long moment, the weight of Arilith's words pressing down on him. He had always fought for survival, but now it seemed that survival meant something far more than escaping his past. The galaxy depended on him, and for the first time in years, Zane felt the heavy mantle of leadership settling on his shoulders. And it terrified him. But he had no choice. The weight of Arilith's words settled heavily on Zane, pressing against his chest like a leaden force. The truth about the Exelthar, the soldiers, the bloodshed, the betrayal, was something he had never anticipated. He had always believed his mistakes were his alone to bear, buried deep in the past. But now they were rising again, clawing at the present, threatening everything he had worked to forget. I don't know what you expect from me, Zane said, his voice thick with disbelief. He turned away from Arilith, his eyes scanning the desolate chamber. I'm not a leader. I'm not the one who's going to save anyone. I've seen too much death, too much destruction. I can't. You already are one, Zane, Arilith interrupted, her voice firm. Whether you want to be or not. Zane shook his head, pacing the length of the room. His thoughts were a whirlwind, each one conflicting with the next. Terran stood quietly by, her eyes darting between him and Arilith, uncertainty written all over her face. She had followed him into this mess, but even she had no idea how far down the rabbit hole they had fallen. I didn't sign up for this, Zane muttered, more to himself than anyone else. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to survive. Arilith's eyes softened, and for a moment, Zane saw something he hadn't expected. Sympathy. I know, but survival isn't enough anymore. Not when the Exelthar are out there, not when everything you've tried to escape is coming for you. The silence stretched between them, thick with the tension of unspoken truths. Zane's mind raced. He could still hear the sounds of his old crew, the ones who had fallen by his side, whispering in the back of his mind. The promise of a better future. The idealism that had driven them to rebel against the very forces they had helped create. But that had been a lifetime ago. What could he do now? You want me to lead, Zane finally said, his voice low. Then where do I even begin? I don't have an army. I don't have any allies left. Everyone I trusted is either dead or scattered. Arilith stepped closer, her eyes fixed on him with unyielding resolve. You do have allies, Zane, and you will find more. The galaxy is fractured, yes, but there are factions out there, pirates, mercenaries, resistance groups. They all hate the Exelthar. They just need someone to unite them, someone they can believe in. Zane's gaze dropped to the floor. They won't follow me. They will, she said, voice steady, if you give them something to believe in. Terran finally spoke up, her tone sharp, but her eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and hope. We fought beside you, Zane, and we believe in you. You're the only one who can lead us out of this. Zane met her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt in her, but there was nothing, only trust. It was an unspoken bond, built over years of fighting together, surviving impossible odds. She was right. He had a crew, a small but loyal crew. That was something at least. And if we fail? Zane asked, his voice hollow. What if I can't do it? What happens then? Arilith's face tightened. If we fail, everything will fall. The Exelthar will conquer this galaxy, and nothing will stop them. They'll wipe out every system they touch, turning them into nothing more than puppets. Zane felt a chill run through him. The magnitude of their mission had always been there, lurking in the back of his mind, but now it was real, too real. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Then I don't have a choice, do I? Zane muttered, his voice barely audible. He looked up, his jaw set in grim determination. All right, I'll lead, but I need to know more. I need to know everything you're not telling me, Arilith. This rebellion, this war, it's bigger than just the Exelthar, isn't it? There's something else at play here. Arilith hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. But she didn't back down. Yes, the Exelthar are the product of a failed experiment. But there are others, other factions who would use them as weapons. Your past, Zane, is tied to a much darker plan. One that could tear the fabric of the galaxy apart. The Exelthar are just the beginning. If you want to stop them, you need to uncover the truth about who's behind it all. Zane's mind reeled as the implications of her words sank in. There was more to this fight than just surviving the Exelthar. There were larger forces at play, unseen and powerful. Forces that would use the chaos of war to further their own agendas, and Zane was right in the middle of it. All right, Zane said, his voice steady now, though his heart was pounding in his chest. Let's gather a crew. Let's unite whoever we can. And let's end this before it consumes us all. Arilith nodded, a small but determined smile creeping across her face. We have a long road ahead of us, but we're not alone, Zane. You'll find the people who will fight for you, and when we do, we'll take the fight to the Exelthar. Zane took a deep breath, the weight of his decision settling over him like an iron mantle. There was no turning back now. The galaxy needed a leader, whether he liked it or not, and he would be that leader. Zane leaned over the holomap projected in front of him, his eyes scanning the scattered systems across the galaxy. His fingers traced the outlines of various planets, all marked in red, key locations where the Exelthar had either already infiltrated or where resistance groups had gathered. It was a web of chaos, and Zane was trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out where to begin. This is impossible, Zane muttered, his voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. How are we supposed to unite all of this? Every system is divided. Everyone has their own agendas. Taryn leaned over his shoulder, her arms crossed. You know the galaxy's fractured, but the Exelthar are the common enemy. We don't need to make everyone love each other, Zane. We just need them to fight together. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. He'd never been one for diplomacy, never been the kind of person who could smooth over differences. He'd always preferred the straightforward, cut-and-dry approach. You either fought, or you didn't. But now, leading a fractured galaxy meant something entirely different. It meant diplomacy, negotiation, and the delicate art of persuasion. Arilith was standing nearby, watching him closely. The first step is finding the key players, the ones who can rally others. You can't do this alone. Zane stood up straight, running a hand through his hair. So we find these key players, what? Promise them power, resources, whatever they want. Exactly, Arilith said. The key is giving them a reason to trust you, a reason to believe you can win. They won't follow you if they think you're just another rebel leader fighting a losing battle. Zane nodded slowly, his mind working. He had no illusions about his ability to win them over with empty promises. But he had something none of them had, the knowledge of the Exelthar's true power, the knowledge that could turn the tide in their favor. He had to make them see that. I'll start with the Bormac system, Zane said, making a decision. He pointed to a star on the map, its red marker flashing. The Bormak resistance is well connected. If we can win them over, we'll have a foothold in that sector. From there, we can start piecing together the rest. Terran looked at him, eyebrow raised. The Bormaks? You're sure about that? Zane grinned, though there was little humor in it. You don't get to be an outlaw without learning a few things about how to work with people like them. Aerolith nodded. It's a good start, but don't expect them to just hand you their allegiance. The Bormak leadership is notoriously independent. They'll test you. Zane didn't flinch. He'd been tested before. Let them. I'm done running. The Bormak system was a far cry from the worlds Zane had grown accustomed to. The air was thick with the stench of smog, the skies a sickly shade of gray. On the surface, the planet's capital was a sprawling metropolis of crumbling buildings and makeshift structures, a testament to the Resistance's constant battle against the Selthar's advancing forces. Zane and his crew landed in the shadow of a giant, rusted fortress, the headquarters of the Bormak Resistance. As they disembarked from their ship, they were met with wary stares from the ragged soldiers who had gathered at the base. The Bormaks were known for their fierce independence, and even a slight misstep would be enough to turn their distrust into hostility. Terran stayed close by Zane's side, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The air was thick with tension, and every footstep echoed like a warning. A grizzled figure stepped forward, his face hidden behind a helmet marked with the Bormak crest. I'm Kor. You've got one shot at convincing us, he said, his voice low and threatening. What makes you think you can offer us anything we don't already have? Zane met Kor's cold gaze with his own, trying to read the man. He didn't flinch. I'm not here to offer you anything, Zane said, his voice calm and measured. I'm here to give you a chance to destroy the Exelthar once and for all. If you want to keep fighting a losing war, that's your choice. But if you want to end this, you'll listen. Kor studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. You'll have your chance, but don't think for a second that we're easy to convince. Zane nodded, recognizing the challenge in the man's words. I'm not asking for easy, I'm asking for trust. The meeting inside the Bormak fortress was tense, every word spoken carefully, every move watched. Zane explained his plan, how the Exelthar's true power could be used against them, how unity was the only way to stand a chance. It wasn't just about defeating the Exelthar. It was about taking back the galaxy from the chaos they had caused. It took hours of back and forth, of bargaining and negotiating, but in the end, Kor and the Bormak leadership agreed. They would join forces under one condition. Zane had to prove his loyalty, not just with words, but with action. The Exelthar were already beginning to mobilize in the region, and they had no time to waste. Zane stood in front of the Bormak command center, his mind still racing with the implications of the alliance. This was only the first step. Let's move out, Zane said, his voice steady now. The fight's only just beginning. Terran gave him a sharp look. You think they'll follow through? Zane looked at the ragtag group of fighters around him, the future of the galaxy resting on their shoulders. I don't know, but they'll have to. There's no other choice. The crew moved quickly, preparing for their first mission as an official alliance. Zane's heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with determination. This was what he had been born to do. Whether he wanted to lead or not, there was no turning back now. The Bormak alliance was a fragile one, but it was a start. Zane felt the pressure mount with every passing hour, the weight of the galaxy's expectations pressing on him like a 1,000-ton stone. They had the Bormak on their side now, but the real battle was only just beginning. The Exelthar were relentless, and every victory they gained meant the galaxy's resistance would be drawn deeper into the conflict. Zane stood in the command center of the Bormak fortress, his gaze fixed on the holomap flickering in front of him. The system was buzzing with activity. Ships were being prepared, communications with the other resistance factions were being established, and plans were being made. They were getting ready for the first real offensive against the Exelthar, a skirmish to strike at their supply lines, to hit them where it hurt. Zane, Arilith's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him out of his reverie. She stood in the doorway, her expression serious. We've just received intel from the Outer Rim. The Exelthar are mobilizing faster than we anticipated. They've already begun to reinforce their hold on the Ander system. Zane's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind racing. The Ander system was one of the most critical regions in the galaxy. If the Exelthar reinforced their position there, they would have a foothold in the core worlds, and that would be disastrous. We don't have time to waste, Zane said, slamming his fist onto the console. We need to move on Ander now, before they solidify their grip. The longer we wait, the more ground we lose. Arilith nodded, her eyes sharp. Agreed. But the Bormec fleet is not large enough to make a direct assault. We'll need more support. Then we get it, Zane said, his voice firm. Call in every faction we can. If we want to win this war, we need to strike now. It wasn't long before the calls went out. Messages sent across the galaxy to every corner, every system, and every ship that might be willing to stand against the Exelthar. Zane knew he was asking for a lot. Alliances were fragile things, and many of these groups had their own enemies, their own grudges. But the Exelthar were a common enemy, and that was the one thing they could all agree on. The response was swift, though, and far more numerous than he had expected. The pirates from the Traskar sector, the independent mercenaries from the Volon Nebula, even smaller resistance cells from the Eduri Fringe. Slowly but surely, the forces began to assemble. It wasn't an army yet, but it was a start. Zane stood on the balcony of the Bormac Command Center, looking out at the ships assembling on the landing platforms. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. The rebels had found their cause, and Zane, whether he liked it or not, was their leader. "You're making progress," Terran said, coming up beside him. She had her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, though there was a hint of approval in her eyes. "Progress?" Zane asked, his voice low. "Maybe, but it's a fragile progress. The Bormac alone aren't enough. We're still outnumbered, and I don't trust some of these factions. The pirates, especially." Terran shrugged. "They don't have to like you. They just have to follow you." Zane gave her a sidelong glance, his lips curling into a wry smile. "I'm not sure I even trust myself right now." She raised an eyebrow, her tone lighter now. "That's what makes you dangerous." Zane chuckled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a gnawing doubt inside him that he couldn't shake. Every step forward felt like a step closer to the edge. One wrong move, one betrayal, and it could all fall apart. But he had no choice. He had committed himself to this path. If he didn't lead, who would? There was no time to second guess. The fleet began its journey toward Andor. The Bormac ships were reinforced by pirate vessels, mercenary ships, and small resistance fighters, an eclectic mix of forces, each with its own agenda. But they were united by one thing, their hatred of the Exelthar. Zane sat at the helm of his flagship, the Cinder's Wrath, his fingers gripping the armrests as the ship cruised through hyperspace. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his resolve. This wasn't going to be easy. "We've got incoming." Arilith's voice crackled over the comms. "Scanners are picking up Selthar warships just outside Andor." Zane stood up, his heart rate quickening. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. "All ships, prepare for battle," Zane said, his voice steady, though his pulse hammered in his ears. "We fight together, or we fall alone. Let's show the Exelthar that we're not done yet." The crew scrambled to their stations, and Zane took a deep breath. His fingers hovered over the controls, his mind racing through the plan. They would strike fast, hit hard, and use their advantage in numbers to overwhelm the Exelthar. He looked out the viewport, the vastness of space stretching before him. The galaxy was fractured, yes, but they were beginning to rebuild it, one battle at a time. And today, they would show that XL that they had underestimated the power of a united galaxy. The void of space was alive with the hum of anticipation as Zane's fleet drew closer to the Ander system. Through the viewport of the Cinder's Wrath, he could see the distant shimmer of Ander's blue and green world, its orbit surrounded by a growing ring of Selthar warships, their sleek forms dominating the darkness like predators closing in on their prey. They had been waiting, ready for the strike that Zane's Galactic fleet had now become. Contact in 5, 4, 3. Arilith's voice buzzed in his earpiece, her calmness in stark contrast to the pounding of Zane's heart. Selthar ships coming out of hyperspace. The holographic display in front of Zane flickered to life, showing the enemy fleet in its entirety. Hundreds of ships, warships, troop carriers, and dreadnoughts loomed like an unstoppable tide, their cold, mechanical forms exuding menace. Zane's Galactic fleet, still in its early stages of cohesion, was far smaller and vastly underpowered by comparison. It was no longer just a battle for the system, it was a statement. Focus on their flagship, Zane ordered, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. If we can take down their command, the rest will crumble. Arilith glanced at him, a flash of concern passing through her eyes, but she didn't question the order. She nodded, sending it to the rest of the fleet. The first barrage of fire from the Selthar fleet lit up the dark void of space. Energy pulses streaked across the distance, slamming into the shields of the advancing ships. The pirate vessels veered to the side, weaving erratically to avoid the blasts, while the Bormak warships formed up in tight formations, creating a wall of defense around the mercenary ships. Shields at 80%, Arilith called out, her fingers flying over the console. We can't hold this for long if they keep this up. Zane's jaw tightened. There was no time to hesitate. He slapped the command panel. All ships, initiate evasive maneuvers. We'll hit them fast, hit them hard, push them back. The fleet scattered into a series of rapid strikes. Pirate ships darted in and out of the fray, unleashing salvo after salvo of ion blasts, while the Bormak ships concentrated their fire on the Selthar's weak points, creating openings in their defenses. Zane's fleet worked in perfect, if desperate, unison. But the Selthar were not the only threat. From the flagship of the enemy fleet, a massive shockwave of energy shot toward Zane's ship, disrupting the comms and causing the entire vessel to shudder. Status report, Zane barked. We're down to 60% shields, Terran replied quickly, her eyes scanning the damage reports. Engines are holding, but if we take another hit like that. Not an option, Zane said, cutting her off. He didn't need to hear more. The fight was slipping from their hands, and it was clear they were being overwhelmed. The Selthar flagship had the firepower to cripple entire fleets with a single shot, and if they couldn't find a way to disable it, this battle would be lost. Zane's mind raced. He had to do something drastic. Then a thought struck him, a memory of an old tactic from his outlaw days, a desperate maneuver that could either win the battle or get them all killed. Terran, he said, turning to her, get me a direct line to their flagship. She blinked at him, confusion crossing her face. What? You want to talk to them? I don't have time to explain. Just trust me. Reluctantly, Terran patched him through, and Zane's voice rang out through the comms. Selthar flagship, this is Zane Solon. I have something you want. There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a cold, mechanical voice. You are a fool, human. Surrender now or be obliterated. Zane's heart raced, but his voice remained calm. You think I'm the one who's making the mistake. You're facing a galaxy united against you. We'll be back, and you won't survive the next wave. But there's something I have that you need. The location of your true enemy, the ones who created you. The pause that followed stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Zane could almost hear the gears turning inside the enemy command center. What are you offering, human? The voice asked, far more measured now. Zane's gamble was a long shot, but it was all he had. Surrender your flagship. We'll leave the system, and you'll have time to prepare. But if you don't, we'll tear you apart piece by piece, and you won't get another chance. The silence that followed was agonizing, but finally the voice returned, tinged with irritation. Very well, your bluff is noted, human, but do not mistake this for mercy. You have 1 hour to leave the system before we annihilate you. Zane exhaled slowly, a cold chill settling over him. He'd won for now, but he knew the Exelthar weren't the type to forget easily. This was only a temporary reprieve, one that could turn into a death sentence if he wasn't careful. He turned to his crew. You heard them. We're taking the flagship. All ships, focus fire on their command vessel. This is the moment. Don't let up. As the fleet closed in on the flagship, the tide of the battle shifted. Zane's gamble had worked, forcing the Exelthar into a retreat, but it was clear they wouldn't leave the galaxy in peace. This was just the beginning. The stakes had been raised, and the Resistance was no longer just fighting for survival, they were fighting for their very existence. The battle for Andor ended in a fragile victory. Zane stood at the bridge of the Cinder's Wrath, staring out at the wreckage of the Exelthar fleet. The blackened husks of warships drifted lazily through space, their lights extinguished, leaving the stars to reclaim their place in the endless night. The Resistance had won this day, but Zane knew the war was far from over. One more victory, and we're a step closer, Arilith said, her voice a rare hint of pride, as she stood beside him, watching the aftermath unfold on the holographic map. Zane nodded but didn't share in her optimism. Victory felt hollow, and the price they had paid was steep. Many of the mercenaries and pirates who had joined the battle were now lost in the wreckage, their ships disintegrated in the chaos of the fight. The Bormec fleet had taken heavy damage, and even with their success, they had suffered casualties. You think we can keep this up? Zane asked, his voice low and tired. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep their patched-together fleet in the fight. We're outnumbered and outgunned. How long until the Exelthar return with reinforcements? Arilith gave him a sideways glance, her expression softening. You're doing something they didn't expect, Zane. They never thought a leader like you would emerge from the chaos. Zane turned toward her, his brow furrowed. Me? I'm not the leader they need. I was a thief, a criminal, not someone who should be leading a rebellion. You've become the symbol they need, whether you want to be or not, Arilith replied, her tone unwavering. You give them hope. That's what matters now. Zane's gaze turned back to the shattered remnants of the enemy fleet. Hope. Was that enough to win a war? He didn't know. All he knew was that if they didn't fight, they would lose everything. And the consequences of that, of what the Exelthar would do to the galaxy, were too dire to imagine. Get a report on the losses, he said, his voice tight with resolve. We need to rebuild, and we need to do it fast. As Arilith moved to relay his orders, Zane found himself alone with his thoughts again. The crew, the fleet, even the galaxy itself, he had led them to this point, but would he be able to continue? The responsibility of leadership weighed on him with a new intensity. He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and each decision from here on out would carry consequences not just for him, but for everyone who had placed their faith in him. He couldn't afford to fail. Later that evening, Zane gathered with his most trusted allies, Terran, Arilith, and the leaders of the factions that had fought under his banner. They stood around a large table in the command center of the Cinder's Wrath, a new mission being drafted in front of them. The holographic map was now dotted with Selthar strongholds and key strategic points across the galaxy, a visual reminder of just how much they had to reclaim. We have the momentum now, Zane said, his voice steady, his confidence growing as the plan began to take shape. We've taken Andor, but we need to push further, or the Exelthar will regroup. We can't afford to let them rebuild their strength. Turin was the first to speak. We hit their weak points. We take out their supply lines, their reinforcements. Hit them where they don't expect it. Zane nodded. Exactly. We can't afford to take any more risks. This has to be a series of coordinated strikes. Hit, retreat, and hit again. And we'll need all the allies we can get. I'm not fool enough to think we can do this alone. A silence fell over the room as the other leaders considered his words. The resistance was still fragile, each faction with its own agendas and distrust, but Zane could feel the shift, the beginnings of true unity, forged in the heat of battle. We can't let fear take hold now, Arilith said. You've already shown them that there's more than one way to fight. Let's make sure the Exelthar understand that they can't hold the galaxy forever. Zane looked around at his allies, at the faces of those who had chosen to stand with him. He saw the determination in their eyes, the hunger for victory. It was small, but it was growing. This is just the beginning, he said, his voice resolute. But if we keep pushing, if we keep fighting, we will win. We'll make sure the Exelthar know that humanity, and every species we've united, will never bow down. The galaxy is ours to save. As the meeting ended, Zane walked to the observation deck of the ship, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what was to come. The stars spread out before him, endless and unyielding. But now, for the first time, he wasn't looking at them as a thief or an outlaw. He was looking at them as the leader of something much greater, a leader of a rebellion that had the chance to change everything. He wasn't sure what the future held, or how far they would be able to push back the Exelthar, but Zane knew one thing for certain: they'd found something worth fighting for, and in the end, that was all that mattered.